listening to the Garde Ecossaise podcast. In this episode, we examine the section To the Reader and Chapter 1, Edinburgh and Leith, 1672. Hello and a very warm welcome to the Garde Ecossaise podcast. This is the official podcast of the Garde Ecossaise novels, hosted by me, Dr. Kirsty Mackenzie. The men in the book are entirely fictional, but the times and events they lived in were real. In this podcast, I will tease out fact from fiction for you, and in doing so, I hope to introduce you to this fascinating period of history. This book is available to buy from Amazon, Kobo, Apple Books, Google Books, Waterstones in the UK, and Barnes & Noble in the US. It is also available from many different retailers in Europe. See the website www.legardeecossaise.net for further details. I am so glad that you have taken the time to join me as I discuss the novels in greater depth and the historical events which inspired them. This podcast is for those of you who are enjoying the novels and those of you who want to learn that little bit more about the history behind the novels. This podcast is also for students studying early modern history courses at college or university. Indeed, the novels purposefully cover many of the key events of the 17th century, events that are covered in many survey courses on the early modern period. I like to think of the book as a textbook for an early modern history course, masquerading as a historical fiction novel. The podcast will closely mirror the contents of each chapter in the novels and explore the real people and events mentioned within them. The podcast is also available as a videocast on YouTube with interesting and helpful visuals. There are also subtitles for those of you who are hard of hearing. You will find transcripts of these podcasts on the Garde Ecossaise blogs. Please visit the website www.legardeecossaise.net to take a look. Let's begin today's episode. In To the Reader, Meldrum writes as follows: Scotland was being threatened by religious tensions. Meldrum then proceeds to take us quickly through 4 decades of religious tensions. This episode will explain the religious changes that Scotland experienced during the early modern period. It will then reflect upon parish life within a small village such as Corstorphine and give a glimpse into Meldrum's life before his journey to Paris. However, to explain these religious changes fully, I have to take you back to the Scottish Reformation in 1560. Before 1560, Scotland was a Catholic country, and as such, it was part of a wider European Catholic culture. For example, a Scot in Edinburgh participated in Mass on Sunday just like a Frenchman in Rouen, or a Spaniard in Cadiz, or a Bavarian in Munich, and so on. Even though each country had its own monarch, the monarch was the secular leader with some religious responsibilities towards their subject, but the head of the Catholic Church in all religious matters was the Papal See in Rome. The interesting aspect of the Scottish Reformation, that is to say Scotland's transition from a Catholic to a Protestant country, which sets it apart from the majority of reformations which took place across Europe, was that it was mainly a legislative affair, where conflict was limited. This should be seen in contrast to the French Wars of Religion, which took place between 1562 and 1598, which resulted in a bloodbath of extreme violence, as France vacillated between the Catholic and Protestant faiths as aristocrats battled for the religious soul of France. Another important aspect that has to be noted about the Scottish Reformation is that it marked a move away from the old alliance with France, a formal treaty which ended in 1560, and a move towards a more formal relationship with England. This move away from France towards England laid the religious foundations of the Union of the Crowns between England and Scotland in 1603, whereby the monarch ruled over a united Protestant British kingdom. If you had visited Scotland in the 1550s, you would have had no inkling of the momentous religious changes that lay ahead. Scotland was a member of the Catholic Church. Mass was practised in every church in Scotland. Ordinary men and women regularly went to confessional, and priests provided the sacraments, marking the key stages of life between birth and death: baptism, first communion, marriage, and the last rites before death. There were monasteries throughout Scotland run by various orders such as the Augustinians, the Carthusians, and the Cistercians. Yet, as historian Gordon Donaldson notes, there was already a decline in the numbers of such institutions before the Scottish Reformation in 1560. Friaries were also common in Scotland before the Reformation, with many being run by the Dominicans, Franciscans and the Carmelites. Whilst many retained their ideals, they were not well funded by the boroughs in which they were situated, so they started to go into decline before the Reformation. However, one area where there was increased interest in education was the foundation of collegiate churches and universities. Ordinary priests and clergy were deeply underpaid, and this was a major weakness in the Scottish Catholic Church, as many in the rank and file had to find other ways to supplement their income. However, this did not mean that Rome or Scotland's secular and religious authorities did not try and improve the church before the break with Rome in 1560. Nunneries were shut down if the situation was critical enough. In 1541, the Scottish Parliament passed acts for the addressing of ills within the Scottish Catholic Church with the support and blessing of Rome. The key question for those within the Scottish Catholic Church in the 1560s was not whether to become Protestant or Catholic. Rather it was, did Rome or the Scottish Church's attempt to reform itself go far enough? Scotland's Reformation came later, 4 decades after Martin Luther had first advocated a complete break with Rome. It was clear for some that the Catholic Church in Scotland was in a spiral of decline. Many of those that became ministers in the new Scottish Protestant Church were underfunded friars and priests who thought the system was irreversibly broken. Others believed that although it was an uphill struggle, the Scottish Church working with Rome could reform itself. Yet arguably what drove Scotland's Reformation was not religious reform, but the wider political and diplomatic events taking place across Britain and France between 1543 and 1560. In 1542, King James V died 3 weeks after the English had defeated a Scottish force at Solway Moss, leaving Scotland to be ruled by his infant daughter Mary, who was later to become known as Mary Queen of Scots. Scotland's infant queen became a pawn in a wider British and European conflict. It was clear that the early Protestant reformers in Scotland preferred a closer alliance with England, despite suspicions about Henry VIII's motives, whereas the infant Queen Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, widow of King James V, was from the fervent French Catholic aristocratic House of Guise, the same House of Guise that was central to the French Wars of Religion, and unsurprisingly she wanted a closer alliance with France. Her daughter's inheritance was under threat from an aggressive English neighbour. France saw an opportunity to curtail England's influence by supporting Mary of Guise. King Henry VIII was not a man to miss a good opportunity to expand England's influence through dynastic marriage. He wanted to establish a marriage alliance between the infant Mary Queen of Scots and his English Protestant heir, Edward VI. Indeed, he came close to his ambitions with the negotiation of the Treaties of Greenwich, which promised the hand of Mary Queen of Scots in marriage to his son Edward. As Jane Dawson has stated, this would remove the confessional border between both nations, forming a closer unity between England and Scotland. However, by the time the treaty was in its closing stages, the pro-French Cardinal Beaton took the reins of government and actively looked for a renewal of the old alliance between Scotland and France. This took place between December 1543, as Mary of Guise's money kept Beaton's cause alive. Between 1544 and 1546, Henry VIII's English forces laid waste to Fife, the Lothians, and the Borders. Historians have called this the Rough Wooing, when Henry VIII invaded Scotland and tried to force Mary of Guise's hand over the dynastic marriage. Cardinal Beaton's life was continually under threat, and he was assassinated by Anglophile supporters in May 1546. With the death of Henry VIII in January 1547, it was for the Protector Somerset, Edward VI Regent, to drive England's policy towards Scotland. Several months later, an English force invaded Scotland, and at the Battle of Pinkercleugh dealt the Scots a severe blow. However, Somerset recognised that there was a need for a growing number of Protestant reformers who saw England as a key ally, so he tailored his proclamations to appeal to this growing section of Scottish society. The proclamations spoke of a bright future for both England and Scotland united by faith. Some Scots who were sympathetic to England began to write about a united realm called Britain. Yet many Scots saw Somerset's English army as an occupying force, and his visions of a new country fell on deaf ears. The English occupation collapsed with Somerset's death, and as it was collapsing, the French seized the opportunity to pour in soldiers and military resources to drive the English army out of Scotland. As historian Jane Dawson concludes, Henry VIII's bullying and Somerset's unionism had driven the Scots straight into the arms of the French. The French signed the Treaty of Haddington, and as part of the terms of the treaty, Mary Queen of Scots was to be brought up in the French court. It looked as if the Old Alliance had triumphed over the Old Enemy, so where did it all go wrong? King Henry II of France's motives in helping Scotland against England were not purely in Scotland's interest. He too had his own ambitions for France and wanted to make Scotland a client state of France, so there was no difference between England and France. Both England and France regarded Scotland as a pawn and also as a territorial acquisition that could help further the ambitions of their own countries. Therefore, the key question was, which empire did the Scots really want to be a part of, England or France? It was these French expansionist attitudes, alongside Mary of Guise's harsh treatment of Protestant reformers, that drove the Scots into the arms of the English. Mary of Guise was invested as regent in 1554, and after exhausting her own money for the war effort against England, she decided to raise taxes by using a far more effective French method. This upset the minor nobility who felt the burden of this new tax. Mary of Guise also wanted to reform the Scottish justice system, stoking fears amongst the Scots that French laws would be brought into Scotland as part of these reforms. Many Scots feared that the French were treating Scotland as a colony, and this was a resentment that Protestant reformers took full advantage of. The death of Queen Mary I of England and the succession of the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I gave the Protestants, both within Scotland and England, hopes of a Protestant Britain and a new era of Anglo-Scottish relations. Their hopes were realised when the Scottish Protestant nobles signed a defensive treaty with Elizabeth I in February 1560. Hope was revived further when in June 1560 the staunch Catholic Queen Regent Mary of Guise died. Her daughter, now Queen of France, but also Queen of Scots, was recognised as her mother's successor to the government of Scotland. However, in 1560, Mary Queen of Scots was still in France, and as such, Protestant reformers took the initiative. It was during this period that the Scottish Parliament passed legislation turning Scotland away from the Catholic Church and towards Protestantism. The Scottish reformer John Knox returned from exile, and his supporters organised themselves into a group known to historians as the Lords of the Congregation, who sought to organise local pockets of Protestant Reformation in Scotland as a national event. In Mary's absence, they rejected the French influence in Scotland and pivoted the nation towards England. Here is another very curious facet of the Scottish Reformation, which contrasts with many other European Reformations. It is that the Scottish Protestant Reformation took place in the absence of the monarch. In England, King Henry VIII had driven the English Protestant Reformation in his own interests, and in France the monarchy and the aristocracy was split between Catholics and Protestants. The legacy of Scotland's Reformation can still be felt today, because the monarch is not the head of the church in Scotland, unlike in England. At the end of 1560, when Mary Queen of Scots arrived back in Scotland, she was a Catholic monarch of a Protestant country. Scotland's Reformation was a reformation enacted through a legislative programme pushed through the Scottish Parliament in August 1560. The easy part was legislating against the Catholic religion. The harder task was agreeing the form in which the new Scottish Protestant Church would take. At first, the Scottish Parliament legislated against the Church practising Catholic Mass. Revenues from the Catholic Church in Scotland were now diverted to build the new Protestant Church. Regarding settling for a new faith, a Book of Common Reformation was drawn up, and bishops were to be retained as part of the structure, as long as they did not practice Catholic Mass. Furthermore, services were to be conducted in Scots rather than Latin, with the Bible and sermons at the centre of the service. In December 1567, the Scottish Parliament met again, and the new Scottish Church was backed by law. As historian Gordon Donaldson comments, the Reformation was achieved in Scotland with surprisingly little dislocation of persons or institutions, certainly with less bloodshed than the English Reformation. Yet there was an emerging division over the form of discipline to be instilled within the Church. Was the Church to be run by bishops, or was there further need for reformation? similar to the Calvinist reformations in Europe, most notably in Switzerland and France. The stage was set for a battle between Episcopacy, which advocated a church run by bishops with the oversight of the monarch, and Presbyterianism, which drew its inspiration from John Calvin in Switzerland, which advocated a church discipline through a series of church courts. The Scottish Protestant Church would move between these two positions over the next 120 years. The question was finally settled in 1689 after William of Orange invaded Britain and established Presbyterianism as the form of church discipline within the Church of Scotland. Moral discipline was a significant feature of the Scottish Reformation, both for the laity and the ministry, but what kind of structure would enforce this discipline? Bishops or kirk courts staffed by elders. The church was to be governed by a general assembly, and the monarch's role was only to promise to maintain the true religion. When the Protestant King James VI inherited the throne, the General Assembly declared that he was the supreme governor of the realm, as well in all things temporal, as in the conservation and purgation of religion. Bishoprics continued to be a feature of the Scottish Church because doing away with them would have caused immense disruption to a church which had largely kept the previous parish structures intact. Religious reformers were aware that they risked alienating the populace if they abolished bishops. Therefore, after the union of the crowns in 1603, Episcopacy, a church governed by bishops, became the established modus operandi of the church in Scotland. However, not everyone believed in bishops, seeing the office as tainted with Catholicism, and preferred a church governed by a series of church courts instead. Andrew Melville and his supporters advocated further change, thereby disrupting any consensus within the Scottish Reformation. He had spent 6 years in Calvin's Geneva, and upon his return to Scotland in the 1570s, he believed that all ministers were equal and advocated a church governed by a series of church courts which acted as peers, rather than a top-down structure of king, bishop and minister. The parity of ministers and the establishment of church courts is the foundational basis of what we know today as Presbyterianism in Scotland. There were debates between those who supported bishops, the Episcopalians, and those who supported Melville's vision of the church, who were later known as Presbyterians. When James VI of Scotland became James I of Britain, he sought to maintain the bishops in Scotland. However, he also sought to maintain both Scottish Episcopacy and English Anglicanism as separate churches, but he wanted to bring them together in conformity in ceremony and liturgy. This met with stiff resistance by those who saw elements of James I's Anglican-inspired policies as tainted with Catholicism. But wisely, James I recognised the objections and backed down from pushing his reforms further. Unfortunately, his successor King Charles I was not so wise, as he sought a closer alignment between Anglicanism and Episcopacy. In doing so, he pushed Scotland, Ireland and England into civil war, with the Presbyterian view of the Scottish Reformation pushed front and centre, leading to the abolition of Episcopacy. It started in July 1637, when the new Scottish prayer book was being read from the pulpit in St Giles Kirk, Edinburgh, which resulted in a commotion and riots, with the prelate being led out by the back by an armed guard. Although the Scottish prayer book had been drafted by the Scottish bishops in consultation with King Charles I, it was perceived by the populace that the Scottish Church was being forcibly pulled into line with its Anglican counterpart. This touched a very raw nerve about Scottish national identity. For the more radical Presbyterians, the new prayer book, tainted by Anglicanism, was more akin to popery, a slanderous term for Catholicism in the 17th century. King Charles I was therefore accused of undermining Scotland's true religion. In response, members of Scotland's elite, clergymen, lawyers and nobles drew up a national religious band or agreement with God to defend Scotland's true religion. This was known as the National Covenant, as people from all levels of society were encouraged to sign. The first signatures took place in Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh in February 1638, and thereafter copies of the National Covenant were circulated all over Scotland and attracted signatures from people from all walks of life, some even signing their names in blood to reaffirm their commitment to God to defend religion in Scotland. Others who could not write left their mark, and women signed the document by the raising of their hands during the local church service. Robert Meldrum in the Garde Ecossaise alludes to this in To the Reader.
I had parents who freely signed the National Covenant in Edinburgh in 1638.
Thus we can glean from Meldrum that his parents were committed Presbyterians or Covenanters, as they were more commonly known, because they were committed to the National Covenant. Between 1637 and 1652, the Covenants and the Covenanters dominated Scottish politics and religion at the expense of the Episcopalians. Scottish bishops were pushed out of office for their loyalty to King Charles I, and so too were university principals and ministers in every parish in Scotland who were vetted for their loyalty to the Covenant. The Scottish General Assemblies that sat during this period were all filled with those loyal to the Covenants. Furthermore, the Covenanters had taken full control of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish printing presses, which regularly churned out Covenanting propaganda. In 1650, Scotland's religious and political landscape changed again, with the approach of Oliver Cromwell's army. Cromwell and his army believed that they were coming to liberate Scotland. Oliver Cromwell's army occupied Scotland from July 1650 until the monarchy was restored in 1660. In To the Reader, Robert Meldrum states,
I was born in Edinburgh in the year 1650, the year of the invasion of the usurper, Oliver Cromwell.
Meldrum is writing his account decades after he was born, and when writing he knew that the monarchy would be restored in 1660. Therefore he has no hesitation in calling Oliver Cromwell a usurper. Furthermore, Meldrum describes his experience of growing up in Leith during the Cromwellian occupation by stating, I grew up in the streets amongst military men and tradesmen of Edinburgh. Cromwell's men were very visible, but made their effort to integrate themselves into local Scottish communities, as Meldrum testifies.
One day we found ourselves playing cudgels with soldiers in the town.
However, Cromwell's army challenged the Scottish Covenanters' hold over the Scottish Church by trying to promote liberty of conscience. Liberty of conscience meant giving people the freedom of religious worship, except if you were Catholic or if you were Episcopalian. Many of the men in Cromwell's army were self-appointed religious men, laymen without a formal education or trained in the ministry who would preach the gospel, sometimes at the expense of the local Presbyterian minister. Meldrum alludes to this when he talks about Captain Smith, a captain in Cromwell's army, who invites Meldrum as a young impressionable boy to a church service for the occupying forces. It is during this service that Meldrum is inspired to become a church minister. Yet he knows that because his parents were Covenanters, they would not have approved of him being in attendance. The Cromwellian occupation ended in 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy under King Charles II. The bishops and Scottish Episcopacy also returned, and any adherence to the Covenants was made illegal. After the return of the monarchy, any new entrants to the Scottish ministry had to take episcopal orders. Meldrum alludes to this when he states in To the Reader,
Like many second sons, I decided to go into the clergy. But when I was ready to enter the clergy, after a time at St Andrews University, the bishops had the governance of the church, and therefore I was ordained according to episcopal orders.
However, trouble was again brewing in the church in Scotland, because those who still adhered to the Covenants wanted to overturn the order of the bishops in Scotland. Charles II, who had been wise to curtail the power of the bishops in the church, included some of those who still adhered to the Covenant in his government, both in church and state. Most notable of these were Archbishop Sharp, the Archbishop of St Andrews, and the Earl of Lauderdale, who became Charles II's secretary in Scotland. Episcopacy became bound up with the preservation of Charles II and his government in Scotland. However, there were Covenanters that rejected this compromise, and were willing to take up arms against the monarch and the state in order to restore the Covenants. Meldrum states this when he says in Chapter 1,
Whilst Scotland was being threatened by religious tensions which had been visible for some time because of the Covenanters, who still felt loyalty towards the national covenants, showed their disgust and contempt for a Scottish church which they felt had lost its way.
These men believed that the Covenants were divinely ordained and eternally binding upon the Scottish people, and this is what drove them to try and overturn church and state. In 1666, radical Covenanting ministers and their followers rose up in rebellion against the state. The origins of the rising lay in the aforementioned loyalty to the Covenants, driven by radical Covenanting ministers who had been deprived of their charges in the southwest of Scotland. They gathered their followers in arms and marched upon Dumfries, capturing the town and one of the king's veteran Scottish soldiers, Sir James Turner. They marched across the country, gathering supporters as they went, before reaching Edinburgh. Their numbers were around 3,000 men. However, the rising failed due to desertions and arguments amongst themselves, but ultimately it was the disinterest from former Covenanting aristocracy and the centre of power in Edinburgh that stopped the rising in its tracks. The city of Edinburgh and Scotland's Covenanting aristocracy remained loyal to the monarchy. The armed force of the radical Covenanters was defeated at the Battle of Rowley Green in November 1666, and an uneasy peace settled over the church afterwards, and the government became more conciliatory in its approach to church matters. But the problem still remained by the time we meet Robert Meldrum in 1672. Meldrum reflects on this in the Garde Ecossaise, stating that the Covenanters amassed armies and raised their own private armies against King Charles II. Here he is not merely talking about the rising of radical Covenanters in 1666, but the troubles caused by the Covenanters in 1679, especially the murder of Archbishop James Sharp, plus another armed rising of Covenanters which came to an end at the Battle of Bothwell Brig by the King's forces under the Duke of Monmouth on the 22nd of June 1679. Although the resistance from the southwest Covenanters had been broken, a small number of Covenanters still held out and were defeated at Ards Moss on the 22nd of July 1680. This explains Robert Meldrum's fear that Scotland was heading for civil war. In 1672, the fear of armed conflict was very real indeed. What was life like for a Scottish minister like Robert Meldrum in the 1670s? His primary roles within the church would have been the reading of scriptures to his congregation and the administering of communion. The use of the prayer book was entirely voluntary, and it is doubtful whether he would have used it in his church services, given his Covenanting background and that of his patron Lord Forester. It was only the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed that were mandatory features in the Scottish church services after the Restoration. The other main role of the minister was to perform sacraments of baptism, marriage and funeral rites. As Meldrum makes clear,
I enjoyed performing the sacraments, especially those that marked the stages of life from birth to death, baptism, marriage and funeral rites.
Yet Meldrum's role would have also been to implement moral discipline in the parish community, disciplining people for various excesses including drunkenness, gambling and fornication. Clearly Meldrum was failing to do this effectively, as he recalls.
There were those who crammed at the back of the church who took no interest in the service at all, who chatted away sharing the village gossip, drinking alcohol, and there was Mr. D who ran a betting stall, who sat there taking small bets on cudgels and horse races and taking poor people's money.
Furthermore, Meldrum's patron, Lord Forester, was an avid gambler and drinker himself. The Reformed Scottish Church, whether in its Presbyterian or Episcopalian form, sought to look after what it called the deserving poor, widows, orphans, the sick and the disabled. The deserving poor were to be distinguished from the undeserving poor, the gamblers, the willingly idle, including the beggars and criminals. Meldrum writes about this, describing how he distributed funds to the needy, i.e. the deserving poor. However, it is clear that Meldrum is beset by a number of problems, which prevented him from doing his work to the best of his ability. The church building was clearly not large enough to hold all the parishioners within the village, and the church refused to increase his maintenance to enable him to look after his parishioners. In the 1670s, many church buildings were in a poor state of repair. Furthermore, Meldrum felt the ire of the more radical Covenanters. These radical Covenanters, the same people who rose up in arms against King Charles II, would meet in secret gatherings called conventicles to preach the gospel, discuss scripture, and to plot the overthrow of the government. Meldrum mentions Mr. S, whom he describes as an active Covenanter, who would challenge Meldrum on his ungodliness and unfit practices. Mr. S would take evidence of Meldrum's conduct to his fellow Covenanters in his local conventicle. To add insult to injury, we find out later that Lord Forester, who he describes as a zealous Presbyterian, has built a meeting house in the village for his fellow presbyters. in effect snubbing and undermining Meldrum's position and authority in the village. This is the catalyst which forces Meldrum to leave his position in Corstorphine and take his journey to London. The voice of Robert Meldrum was provided by Gaz Kerr. Sound files were provided by the following. Catholic Mass was provided by Yahau M. Santos at Freesound. Street Preacher was provided by Echo Bones at Freesound. St Agnes Church Rome was provided by Tim McCann at Freesound. The theme tune for the podcast is provided by Iconics Music.
This podcast is the copyright of History Gateway Limited, UK.